All right. Hi, everyone. We are here with Adam White from the University of York, who just delivered a paper in our conference, our workshop on the privatization of warfare. And Adam, can you tell us a little bit about the paper that you delivered today?
Sure. So my research background is in policing and how the private security industry fits into the policing sector. And recently, it's become apparent that a number of private military contractors fresh from the circuit in Iraq and Afghanistan are finding their way into the domestic private security industry and performing roles such as door supervision, security guarding, residential event security. And this struck me as a very interesting development because it's kind of blurring the boundary between, if you like, hostile environments and policing within a more stable civil society. And so I started to ask questions about how these contractors are finding their way back to the domestic security sector and to what extent it mimicked or looked like the ways in which soldiers demobilise after they've left a hostile environment and reintegrated back into society. And so this research is focused upon, if you like, empirical exploration of me tracking down contractors, those who they used to work for, currently work for, as well as those in the charitable sector, and trying to piece together a picture of what I've called the demobilisation of private military contractors. Do you want me to tell you a bit more about what I found?
What did you find?
What kind of problems are they likely to encounter when they come back from the hostile environment? Presumably, the kind of skills that they have developed, when they are let's say, deployed in hostile environments are somehow different from the skills that they need to integrate in civil society.
Sure. To an extent, what I found was a spectrum. So it's important to emphasise that for a lot of contractors, there's no problem. And there's nothing actually particularly to study. They will move from the circuit in Iraq, Afghanistan. They might use some old networks from their military days, because a lot of them are ex-military in the paras or in the SAS, to find some new work in the domestic security sector. They might have a variety of skills, many of which are relevant to domestic security, and they reintegrate very well. However, that's one end of the spectrum. I also found, if you like, a variety of issues that would sit at the other end of the spectrum. And it's a slightly sad tale, essentially, where you have individuals who have maybe spent a few years in military service, maybe from the age of 18, and they become very much socialised into military culture, whereby you the military looks after your shelter, clothing, food, etc. You get paid a wage at the end of each month, but you don't really know how to manage that money because the military always looks after you. And they've gone over to Iraq in 2003, 4, 5, moved over to the private sector for a variety of reasons, one of the main ones being the significantly larger sums of money they get paid, and become private military contractors. Then their contracts will end, often quite suddenly, because there's not much contract stability. And they'll find themselves, if you like, leaving Baghdad on the Monday and finding themselves in Durham on working the doors, 5 or 6 days later, with very little in between. Now that can be problematic because, as you mentioned, there can be a skills transition issue in Iraq, Afghanistan, in a hostile environment, and the threats are obviously much greater, and you attune yourselves to those threats. You then bring that back to the UK, where the threat levels are very different, but you respond actually in a very similar manner to you would have done in Iraq, and that can lead to problems with regard to excessive use of force, etc. There are other issues as well, that you might find that you don't integrate very well back into the domestic security market as a consequence, and you might not have very good old boy contacts from your ex-military days that would help smooth that transition. And so you find yourself unemployed. You don't have the right skills. You probably don't necessarily have the life skills to then, if you like, govern your own transition. Because of the time you spent in the military, you've, as I say, you're not used to looking after yourself and managing your money, because you're used to blowing it in a garrison town at the end of each month. Which as a consequence means you might not have much of a pot of money that you've saved during your period as working as a contractor to draw upon. And very sadly again, in addition to this, a small proportion inevitably have picked up a variety of physical and mental health problems, for instance PTSD being the one that is in the media. And that increases dependence on drugs and alcohol. It can enhance the degree to which people are aggressive, and again makes you even more unsuitable for domestic employment. And so this very sad sort of end of the spectrum can result in people who find it difficult to have employment, are suffering from a number of problems, and start to become potentially involved in crime, might become homeless. And there's this very sad statistic that 10 to 12% of the prison population are veterans, and you end up in that category. With regard to how do you break that cycle, well, arguably quite rightly, the government looks after soldiers, and the charities are orientated towards soldiers. So charities, I mean, Help for Heroes or Combat Stress or Royal British Legion. And the decision made by many former military personnel to shift over into the private sector has not completely, but it's meant it's more difficult to access that charitable, that sort of benevolent fund, if you like, for them. The state, the MOD, they don't fall into their reintegration programs, and so there isn't much help out there. And as a consequence, it can be quite difficult to break that cycle. Whether or not that is a policy issue that should be addressed or should not be addressed is an interesting debate in itself.
That's very interesting, because a lot of the research that deals with private military security companies deals with the kind of issues before the deployment, the problems in terms of what this means for state sovereignty and so on, and a second strand deals with the problems during the deployment, so issues of human rights violations and so on. But your research deals with the aftermath of the deployment of these people, and you demonstrate that there are problems as well that require some policy solution. So what is the policy problem, for, if you can define it, and what are the options that we are facing in terms of addressing it?
Well, actually, to first of all speak to the first part of your question, it's very true, I think, that there's a significant and excellent literature on private military contracting, but it is very much focused on hostile environment. And a lot of the questions that are asked come from an international relations, war studies, military studies perspective. So what are the implications in terms of politics, law, human rights, democracy, morality of using private military contractors within military and peacekeeping operations? They all speak to the hostile environment. That literature tends not to ask questions about, well, what happens when they come back home. There is an additional literature on the military covenant, which looks at the relationship between armed forces, society and the soldier, which looks at how soldiers can be brought back to their home countries and reintegrated, but the private sector is not included in that covenant. And so there is this there's a lack of debate, I would say, about what should happen to private military contractors when they come back home. There's not much guidance I've found in the very good academic debates that cover those other areas. What are the policy issues? Well, the most obvious one relates to social harm. You have potentially, and I must say this is the one end of the spectrum, and many will fall in between it. Potentially, you have individuals who are suffering from a number of, if you like, mental health problems, who are in a role that might require them to use physical force, for instance, work in the doors of a nightclub, and that might cause them to behave inappropriately, and therefore that becomes an issue of social harm to those in the community. And of course, there's also very sad statistics about the number of suicides among veterans, because you get dependent on drugs and alcohol in order to manage, for instance, post-traumatic stress disorder, and that leads to another sad consequence. So there's issues of social harm that I think could be addressed in terms of policy. Lord Ashcroft recently released a report on veterans' transitions, looking at how these issues impact upon soldiers, and suggested a number of quite reasonable and logical policy solutions to some of these problems. For instance, 24/7 telephone hotline that you can call if you are in trouble, more information on the web in a more accessible format, so that if you're suffering from these problems, you know where to go. Now, of course, you could extend these services to private military contractors in order to address that social harm issue. But if you like, the consequence of doing that is that you also start to create a welfare safety net for the privatisation of war, if you like. You to an extent, you might end up legitimating the whole process of contracting out military functions to the private sector.
So that's
through
a question
that
of
welfare
responsibility, isn't it? Because private or not, they are being sent there by the state, so their contract is with a state. Should the state not have a responsibility because they're not publicly employed but privately employed, even though they're there on behalf of a particular public interest?
I think there's two different ways of asking that. I mean, of answering that. Sorry. One is that yes, you could clearly draw a link. Okay, the contractors was the Foreign Office, and the company, if you like, the Foreign Office has a contract with, uses a number of private military contractors. In the course of conducting those operations, they encounter a series of problems. You can trace level of responsibility maybe back to the Foreign Office and say, well, this is your problem. Contractually, however, that's very a nebulous area to enter into, because once the contract with the Foreign Office ends, in theory, it's no longer their responsibility. Does it then lie with the company? Because obviously a lot of these contractors are working for large private military corporations, so they have a duty of care. And my research, I think, has shown that some do actually exercise a duty of care and try to look after their personnel. But others don't, because again, once the contract ends, if you like, it's someone else's problem. So I think there are chains of responsibility that you can draw, but because in various points in that chain there are contracts that sever links between individuals, then the problem gets shifted along in a way that it doesn't, if you like, when you draw the chain of responsibility between the soldier, the armed forces and the state, because there are no contractual severances, rather the responsibility is clearer.
Yeah, I wonder, I mean, if you can just jump in. I mean, you mentioned that there might be some sort of normative dimension to whether we should somehow address the public policy problem that is created by the return of private military contractors to civil society. I wonder whether one way of seeing the problem is that we are kind of torn between two intuitions. One is that insofar as we consider the individuals and perhaps the kind of social problems that they create, we want to address them. On the other hand, when we consider their role as part of as private military contractors, we somehow feel that addressing them, their problems in a special way, then would actually incentivize people to make the decision to become a private military contractor. And so I guess, I wonder whether there is a sense that this is the kind of options that we are confronting, and is there something that you think, is there a synthesis? What is the way forward? I
think the best way to describe it is it's a dilemma. I think there are clearly rationales for developing policy solutions to help both the contractors themselves and those who are potentially impacted by the contractors carrying out security functions when perhaps they shouldn't be. There's that social harm rationale, but there's also the, if you like, the opposite side of the debate, which says, are we comfortable with providing welfare support in a way that might enable and facilitate the growth of the private military sector, and shift, if you like, more and more resources away from the state towards the market. And given that a lot of the debate surrounding private military contracting quite rightly focuses on a lot of the problems associated with this industry, which can relate to, for instance, physical violence conducted outside of democratic human rights, humanitarian legal frameworks, spread of, if you like, military expertise outside of traditional institutional boundaries, and private interests influencing foreign policy, and also, the moral objection, which is, should you profit from war and death and destruction? When you bring all of that into the picture, you think, do you want to create a welfare system or welfare framework, either in the public sector or the charitable sector, that, if you like, legitimates or helps all of that to happen? And that's where I think the dilemma comes, because I think it's a brave decision to do that, and it very much depends upon, I suppose, your own normative orientation and where you sit within this picture.
And I suppose that, in a sense, part of the whole rationale of privatization of warfare and the outsourcing of these activities of the state to private companies has to do with exactly the abdication of responsibility. So part of the rationale itself is to avoid having to take that responsibility.
Transfer the risk.
Risk transfer, exactly. Now, one of the conceptual tools that you've discussed today was the notion of an anti-hero. So what kind of clarity or insight does that offer us into that dilemma that you just described?
Well, this is a concept I've been playing with, and it's, if you like, it came out of a dialogue between the two literatures I mentioned earlier, the private military contracting literature, which looks at the role of private military contractors in hostile environments. And the normative orientation of that literature is, I think, in many ways very anti this development, or at least is sceptical to the extent that there's lots of calls for regulation or stipulations put on private military contracting to try and curtail the number of these ethical and practical problems I've described. It's anti-literature. The military covenant literature is very much about, well, soldiers give up a lot when they fight for their state, and they often come back home with a variety of problems, whether it's physical or mental health problems related to their skills, if you like, developing skills that are relevant to the contemporary economy. And as part of the relationship between the armed forces, the soldier and the state, there's a sense that, the soldier should be helped. They should be helped in this transition. They are heroes. They deserve their reward. And I actually find that the private military contractor can be quite usefully described as an anti-hero, in that they have often worked in roles that further coalition causes, either directly through a foreign office contract or indirectly through a variety of other institutions. They've often also been in the military anyway, and have dedicated a number of years to fighting for their country. But the way in which they've gone about this brings into the picture all of these problems that the private military literature highlights. And so what you have is this, what I've termed anti-hero. They've done a lot of good things, but the way in which they've gone about it, they might not have done good things, of course, as a lot of human rights violation literature shows, but the way they've gone about it is morally problematic. And indeed, one of the definitions of an anti-hero is a main character in a narrative who does not have normal heroic qualities such as moral goodness. And I think that in many ways captures this, the private military contractor when they come back to their home country, because they're not treated as heroes. And the charitable sector does not, if you like, welcome them back with huge, funds, celebrity endorsements in order to enable that transition. The media does not greet them with, our brave boys coming back home. The beginning of Prime Minister's questions does not begin with a tribute to our soldiers in Iraq and Afghanistan. They do not receive that hero's welcome. Yet they still may well have done, if you like, things that further the coalition cause. And so I think you can quite usefully use the idea of an anti-hero to understand how this demobilisation process operates.
Okay. And one of the interesting issues that you've just raised is the issue of regulation, and the fact that this is quite a highly unregulated sector. And in fact, in some of your other research, you highlight the fact that quite counterintuitively, the industry really craves more regulation, which is something that we wouldn't necessarily intuitively anticipate, because this is a part of the privatization process, and largely seen as a process of deregulation. So why is it that the industry craves further state regulation, in your opinion?
I think this is a practice that happens probably both in the domestic private security industry and in the private military industry. Both industries are treated as, if you like, tainted trades. They have, if you like, a sceptical moral standing because they are profiting from safety, security of citizens. And I think we're socialised in UK culture to grow up thinking, well, if you're in trouble, you call the state, you dial 999, or the military will look after you from external threats. You're socialised into thinking that the state is there to look after you, and these private, if you like, organisations who are profiting from this very deep emotional, I think, relationship between the individual and the state, the classic social contract, puts them in a very difficult situation. I think you see throughout, if you like, media treatment and public discourse on private security and military contracting a deep degree of scepticism. And I think that's where a lot of the scepticism comes from. Now, if you're the chief executive of a private security or military company, this is clearly a barrier to your market expansion, because obviously your consumers aren't necessarily welcoming you with open arms because of these sceptical discourses surrounding your operations. Now, one way in which you might be able to circumvent or somehow placate these sceptical discourses is to look and feel a little bit more like a state institution, because as I've mentioned earlier, I think in this country we're socialised into thinking that security and military operations are inherently governmental functions. This is what the state should do. Now, obviously, a key way in which you can look and feel a bit more like the state, and if you like, capture or integrate some of the professional practices of police and soldiering, is to be regulated, to ask the state, well, if you regulate us, if you impose upon us a series of codes and conduct and behavioural stipulations, then we will then be not just a market for force, but will be in part a state regulated, often state deputised industry that can appeal to the stateness, if you like, that is often prioritised within these sectors. And so regulation has an interesting political position, I think, in the private security and military market. On one hand, the state can use it in order to clamp down on unethical or problematic practices in these industries. But of course, in doing that, you're also arguably serving to legitimate their operations even further by giving them a certain stamp of approval that these companies can then use in order to win more contracts. It looks better to say, stamp of approval by the Foreign Office or the Home Office, because you're in accordance with societal norms with regard to security and military provision. So regulation is a tricky issue, I think, in this sector. It's a pivot around which a lot of political negotiations and wranglings between the industry and the state takes place.
And of course, there is some level of regulation already in place. I'm wondering if that can resolve the problem that we started with, which is what happens when private security contractors demobilize. Can regulation then not be imposed on the responsibility or liability of the companies to their personnel once they are demobilized?
Well, regulation here is important to distinguish between the fact that the UK domestic security industry is regulated through statutory regulation, the Private Security Industry Act 2001. The military sector at present is not regulated by the state. There's no statutory regulation in place. There are a variety of codes of conduct,
which are supported by the British government.
Well, in so much as the British government will actually contract with them. And regulation, if you like, is then conducted through the contract, but not through any statutory framework.
I see.
So, in answer to your question, could regulation help this? Potentially, if the statutory requirement was that there's a duty of care towards the contractor, then obviously it would have to be complied with.
Though presumably the private actors would be less happy about that kind of regulation.
I would imagine they would be. There's a lot. The thing with things like post-traumatic stress disorder, or if you've got physical problems such as having amputee, these are long-term problems that there's no quick fix, and can require years and years of investment in rehabilitation. And so that's something that would have to be very carefully approached, because who's essentially going to pay for it?
Adam, thank you very much for joining us today. These videos will be live on the web, and hopefully we'll get some debate going on in a wider sense.
Pleasure. Thank you for inviting me.